Folks, we have reviewed Wahed Invest last year, but since then, a lot has changed. The stock market went through the roof and then it crashed and now it's slowly recovering. Wahed Invest itself has been in the news a lot lately. And importantly, the market has changed. New entrants have entered into the Sharia compliant investment market and exited as well. So we thought, all in all, it would be a good time to just revisit the key question: is Wahed Invest a great place to invest in 2023? In this video, we will cover Wahed Invest's business model and a bit of background about Wahed. We'll cover its public markets, i.e. its stock investing side of things. We'll also cover a little bit about its private markets investing side of things. We'll then also discuss some of the upcoming launches and products that Wahed has trailered that will be launching in the coming months and years. And then to round off, I will share my personal sentiments and thoughts about Wahed Invest from an investor's perspective. Let's dive in.
Ibrahim, a few disclaimers before you begin. This is not financial advice. This is simply our view of the company. We've not been asked or paid for this review by Wahed, so we will only speak openly and honestly, as is our ethos. We also run an investment business on the side called Curate Capital, which I'm sure you've heard of. This does not offer any public market investments, which is Wahed's core focus, but it technically is a competitor to Wahed on its private market side. So we thought only appropriate to flag this beforehand. Back over to you, Ibrahim.
Thanks, Khizr. Fundamentally, Wahed Invest started off in 2015 in the USA as a robo-advisory investment platform. It developed in the US and then 2-3 years later it came to the UK and since then has gone to places like Malaysia as well.
A robo-advisory, simply put, is a number of pre-selected portfolios which are recommended by an investment committee for different risk profiles. So based on what you say your risk profile is, it will spit out a recommended portfolio which you can then invest into. Essentially, this is perfect for new investors who don't want to really make any mistakes and they're happy to pay a small fee for someone more experienced than them to manage this investment portfolio for them.
Thanks, Khizr. So, how does Wahed Invest actually make money? Well, it makes money by charging a percentage fee on something called AUM, or assets under management. So how much AUM does Wahed Invest actually have? Because working that out will give us a good indication of what kind of business model it runs. Well, if we look at some of the online reports around Wahed Invest's US funds, that's halal ETF and the Ummah ETF, we find out that they have around $277 million in assets under management. This might sound like a lot of money, but when you take into account the usual business expenses, the salaries, the dozens of people that have to work for a company, actually that doesn't end up being a huge amount of money. So Wahed Invest is very much still on a trajectory, and we as Muslim investors, if it is appropriate for us, should try our best to support organizations like that so that they can get to that scale that is needed. However, Wahed Invest have raised over $50 million in funding, so they have that time and space to be able to work out and scale their offering. Let's start with their app. I think it's a great app. It's slick, it's usable, it doesn't really have that many glitches. I like it. But when it comes to their desktop, their offering is pretty limited in its functionality and visibility. They basically point you to the mobile app to do all of the fun stuff and all of the more detailed stuff. And that is pretty limiting, especially if you're not someone who necessarily wants to do all your transactions on the mobile app. I'm sure that's something on their roadmap. Another downside is that you can't really easily switch between the different funds once you've invested in them. So I've been investing with Wahed and some of my family have invested with Wahed, and to switch from one fund into another is possible, but you kind of have to go through their support and it needs a little bit more work to be able to get that done. So that's something that I'm sure they can work on as well. Performance is another big one that we need to talk about. So Wahed Invest is of course a stock investing app, and during the last few years the stock market went absolutely ballistic, and so people have come to us and said, well look, Wahed Invest didn't go absolutely ballistic for me, what's that all about? Well, the reason is because funds that Wahed invest in are actually a way to give you a bit more of a measured exposure to the stock market. So you wouldn't expect them to go ballistic themselves, you would expect them to give you a bit more of a measured upside return, which they kind of did. So all in all, no big issues there for me. However, unfortunately now the stock market has tanked, and this time we see a bit of a problem, because you see most halal stock funds that exist in the world today, both the Wahed but also all other stock funds that I've come across, are heavily heavily leaning towards US tech stocks. And that becomes a problem because when those companies get hit worst, that overexposes Islamic funds to that downside. That effectively means that Islamic funds start performing even worse than your typical fund because they have that overexposure to US tech stocks. This is something I am sure the Wahed Invest Investment Committee is taking a look at. If you look at the biggest holdings in their ETFs, then you see Apple and Microsoft are reported in the public disclosures as the biggest holdings, with the next holding after that at 6 million. So this is clearly a bit of a strong exposure to US tech stocks, in particular 2 companies. And I'm sure plenty of thought went into that and continues to go into that in terms of how to manage concentrations to US tech stocks. However, it's not actually all doom and gloom, ladies and gentlemen, because you see the stock market has gone down quite considerably, and now we're seeing the shoots of potential recovery in the months ahead. And so if you're starting to invest now or thinking about putting in money now, and you're looking to invest for the long term, let's say 5, 10, 15, 20 years, especially if you're dollar cost averaging into a fund, then going and investing in something like a Wahed is not a bonkers idea by any stretch of the imagination. But if you are looking to invest in much shorter term time periods, there are definitely better places for you to look than Wahed Invest. Typically, they are in the fixed income space that will give you a steady return and also make sure that you don't get yourself exposed to the underlying volatility that comes with a stock market exposure.
So dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you or I, the investor, would invest a fixed amount on a regular basis regardless of the share price.
When it comes to the fees, I have been, I think, overall impressed with Wahed Invest. I think that their ETF fees are pretty reasonable. I think their UK fees are pretty competitive now as well. I think their US robo-advisory fees are pretty expensive, but I think that is because that's not the core part of their business. In the US, I think the expectation is that people would just directly invest in the ETF via a stockbroker platform or equivalent. I may be wrong, but that's my impression. When speaking to users though, one thing that keeps on coming up again and again is accessibility for international investors, because Wahed Invest does kind of come across as an international company. However, investors, particularly in the Middle East and places like that, get very frustrated that they don't actually have the ability to invest in Wahed. So people in the UK and the USA and Malaysia are definitely well catered for. They definitely can invest in Wahed, but other places seems to be a bit more of a looser kind of story, and my overall impression is that it's a bit of a struggle to get to invest at the moment. But I'm sure that Wahed Invest again are working on that. One plus that I really liked is that they've added in a gold fund, which I think has done pretty well. Gold generally has done well this year, so that was nice to see. And I think that adding more funds generally into the Wahed mix is definitely a good idea. All in all then, I think as a general Islamic public markets offering, Wahed Invest has done a pretty decent job at that. However, I think there are a bunch more things that could be done in the public market space. So things like, halal stock investing as opposed to fund investing. Things like offering funds to more sophisticated investors who want a slightly higher return or a bit more of a managed return where someone is actually doing the stock picking. I think that would be appealing to many investors. Or people who might want to construct their own Islamic fund out of mainstream funds. That again could be a very interesting proposition. Instead, what Wahed Invest have decided to do is focus a little bit more of their energies on the payment side of things and also on the private investment side of things. While I feel that the job has not fully been done yet on the public market side, and it is their expertise and their experience. So I feel like they've slightly jumped ahead, whereas there could be a lot more stuff that could be done on the public market side. The other blemish that Wahed Invest took on in 2022 was the SEC fined them $300,000. We've covered that in another video, and to be fair to them, I think they have responded really well to that, and they've beefed up their compliance and regulatory function, which I think is great. In the UK, Wahed Invest also has a SIP and pension offering through a company called Option Pensions. However, I think this is still a little bit nascent and perhaps not as user friendly, and we at IFG personally have found someone like a Nest to be a little bit more user friendly. So we asked our community about their experiences of using Wahed as well, and this is the kind of responses that we got. One user pointed out that whilst the customer service he experienced was great, it did take a little bit of time to sort out his issues. One issue that he did have was the bit of a lag between the performance of the ETFs and that being reflected in the portfolio, which means that when it comes to exit, especially if you're getting close to the wire at the end of the tax year, that posed a little bit of a challenge for him. Ultimately, both of the reviewers that got in touch with us had generally positive experiences. Overall, both of these users did say that they would ultimately stick with Wahed and continue using them. We were talking in this particular case to the Wahed public markets customers, not the WahedX customers. Wahed Invest is certainly the biggest Islamic fintech out there globally today. However, they are not the only show in town. There are actually a number of other alternatives. Let's dive into them. In the USA, there is Agaz Invest and there is Zoya that is also coming into the market shortly. Amal Invest is another interesting proposition that is Y Combinator backed and is based in the UAE, and they allow people to look at mainstream funds, put a Sharia screen over them and then invest in all of those stocks, which is a pretty cool concept. And I understand that you can invest in Amal Invest from all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East. In the UK, Simply Ethical is the oldest and probably most well-established player in this space, and they have a financial advisory arm. They also have a SIP, a pension offering, and they have a robo-advisory offering that is well diversified as well at reasonable rates. And their website and platform has gone a serious upgrade, which is one of the big issues with them before. So definitely you can check them out if you are in the UK. Baraka, Sarwa, Pension Bee are some of the other players out there globally that you can also look at. And there's a number of players within Malaysia and in the Middle East. You can look at the individual banks themselves who offer some Sharia compliant investment options as well. So all in all, a pretty competitive market out there. So make sure you really do your research around this whole space. And it does vary from country to country. What is the best option for you at your particular time of life? Wahed have launched WahedX, which is an equity crowdfunding platform that is focused on Muslim-founded businesses and focuses on technology startups. Now, for much of last year, Wahed Invest had a business model where they would charge startups for raising money for them. For many reasons that we have covered in other videos and articles, this is not a great idea because you're not setting yourself up for getting into the top startup deals. And the reason is because the top startups are not short of people who are going to give them money. So if you're charging them money to raise for them and they don't need the money, so you're not going to get into those deals. My understanding is that WahedX have now become a little bit more flexible in that they won't necessarily always charge a startup to raise money for them. I think that is a welcome step because it takes them closer to the journey of setting their business model up so that they will be able to get into the best startup deals, and that is only good for investors that are on the platform. Now, in terms of deals that WahedX have done so far, they have done 6 deals. Now, as a direct competitor, I don't think it would be fair for me to individually comment on the companies and the deals, but as a general point, I would say that if you're looking at any platform, you should look at a few key things as part of your due diligence. The first is their deal flow. How high quality access are they getting to the best deals in the world? And a good indicator of this would be the kind of co-investors that they are regularly attracting to their deals. You don't always need an outstanding co-investor in every deal, but having those regularly is a good indication that you are hunting or you're fishing in the same pond as the best investors globally. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would look at is track record. How many deals have they done? How many deals have they exited? That is a really good indicator in pretty much every investment category you can think of. And the third thing is the fund manager themselves. How are they going to add value to the individual company? Because if there is no story on how a fund manager can add value to an individual company, then they are going to struggle to get into the best and most hotly contested startup deals. Other positives of WahedX is that I've heard the customer service is pretty good, and I've personally experienced it myself when I registered on the platform, which is great to see. One blemish on the WahedX offering right now is that they don't offer a fund. So you have to invest in individual companies, which of course takes a while for you to then develop a diversified portfolio. This is something that I'm sure they will be working on in the years to come. All in all then, I think it is brilliant to see new entrants into the venture capital ecosystem. Ultimately, if it means more high quality Muslim founders get the backing that they need, that is only a good thing, and that goes to the mission that we will fight for every single day, which is helping Muslims level up financially. So I think that if you are an investor and if you're interested in VC investing, you should definitely check them out. You should definitely check out their deals, and if any of those seem to fit, seem to catch your eye, and it's appropriate for you, then go ahead and invest. There are of course alternatives to WahedX out there. The most obvious one is in the mainstream. AngelList is the most obvious one, Republic and others. However, the problem with those is that they're not always Sharia compliant. But if you are savvy and you know what you're doing, you can navigate through that. Of course, we have our own platform, Curate Capital. We've done 70 plus deals on there now. This is not the video to be trumpeting our own horn. We'll do a separate video where we detail everything that we do on Curate Capital. So subscribe and you'll find out about that in the videos to come. For people who are looking for South Asian startups, there is also Ethis out in Malaysia/Indonesia, which you can check out as well. And my understanding is that there are now some new platforms establishing slowly in the Middle East as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that turns up in the coming year or two. They have a payments account coming up, which is quite interesting. That is ultimately going to be, I understand, gold backed. I think the key thing there that will be of interest to me as a potential user is the fees associated with it. Is it going to be more or less expensive than if I was to use a normal debit card? And also, is it going to be quite volatile? Because ultimately, I transact in fiat currency. I transact in actual money. And this is going to be gold. So will my money of £1,000 change both up or down over time? That's something that I want to get my head around, and I'd be interested to hear your views in the comments below as well. And I'd love to see how others respond to the Wahed Invest offering once it launches. I certainly love the fact that they're innovating in this space, and that's something to be welcomed. There are a number of competitors in the ecosystem. I think a number of them have sadly fallen by the wayside over the last couple of years. However, Nomo, which is a Middle Eastern backed bank, has come to the market recently, and they do have aspirations to really focus on the UK audience rather than just their Middle Eastern audience that are coming across. So watch out for them. Algebra is a bit more of an ethical focused bank, so I'm not sure it's bang on the Islamic audience, but definitely that's out there as well. So you should keep an eye out on that. And I believe they will at some point be offering Islamic financing as well. It's great to see people innovating in the payment space. That is fantastic. However, as we develop as a community, I'd love to see more people doing stuff in those areas where we haven't really innovated at all yet. Things like SME financing at a really deep scale. You know, people like Gordos have been trailblazers there. I think we need to do a lot more. There's so many types of SME financing that needs to be done. And then secondly, insurance is another space that I don't think has been fully executed on either. Look folks, all in all, if you are investing as a beginner investor or a time poor investor, you want to invest in a Sharia compliant stock market, ISA, investing between £500 up to a few £1,000s, perhaps 10,000, 20,000. I don't think you're going to go far wrong by choosing something like a Wahed Invest. I think it's a pretty solid offering when it comes to the public market side of things. I think if you're a more sophisticated or high net worth investor, or you're an international investor, there are a number of other high quality offerings out there for you to consider. People like Nesta, of course, us, Curate Capital, people like Funding Su, Gordos, Irad, and the list goes on. So all in all, guys, do I think Wahed Invest is a great place to invest in 2023? I think for a certain kind of investor, absolutely. And we should, as a community, be supporting people like Wahed Invest. I think there are a bunch of other options out there, particularly if you're a bit more of a sophisticated or high net worth or international investor. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.